Reborn in 1960, my husband switched my identity with my sister's. I fought back and reclaimed my future. Chapter 1, The Betrayal Unveiled. The sun had barely risen when I saw them, Charles, my husband, and my younger sister, Sophia, standing outside our small apartment, their voices low and urgent. It was an ordinary morning, but nothing felt normal. I was supposed to be preparing for the college entrance results to arrive any moment. I had worked tirelessly for this moment, pouring my heart and soul into studying for years. But when I caught a glimpse of them through the window, something felt off. I walked closer, my footsteps silent as I leaned against the door, not wanting to interrupt their conversation, but also unable to ignore the nagging feeling in my chest. Charles and Sophia were talking, but their words were too muffled for me to hear clearly. Still, I caught enough to know that something was wrong. My name wasn't mentioned once, not even in passing. Instead, I heard Charles's voice, steady and low, speaking to Sophia with a sense of finality. "Once the results come through, you need to be ready," he said. "You'll be Emily from now on. You need to act like her. We can't let anyone know." My heart sank as I realized what was happening. They had been planning this for weeks, I was sure of it. I knew my sister had always been my parents' favorite, their so-called golden child, while I had always been the one who had to fight for their attention and approval. But I never imagined Charles would betray me like this. I didn't scream. I didn't shout. I simply stood there, frozen, a cold wave of realization crashing over me. Charles, the man I had trusted with my heart and future, was in on this deception. They were planning to switch our identities, to rob me of the future I had earned and hand it to Sophia, just because she was the one they thought was deserving. I had worked so hard for the exam, to prove myself, to show everyone, including my parents, that I was capable of succeeding, of making something of myself. But now, I saw how easily they would throw me away, all because of a simple lie, a lie they thought would secure their image in society, a lie that would make Sophia the one who would bring honor to the family. I walked away, my heart racing, as the weight of the betrayal settled in. I needed to act. I needed to confront the truth. I didn't let the shock paralyze me. I wasn't going to let them destroy my future. Instead of crying, instead of confronting them in the heat of the moment, I made a decision. I would go to the university myself. I would speak to the admissions office. I would make them see the truth, and I would make sure that no one would be able to take what was rightfully mine. I quietly packed a small bag, gathering only what I would need for the trip. I left a note on the kitchen table, a brief message for Charles. "I know what you're doing. I won't let you take my place." Then I left, walking out into the cold morning air, my heart heavy with a mix of fury and determination. The train station was bustling with activity, but it felt as though the world had slowed down around me. I didn't need anyone's help, I didn't need anyone's sympathy. I would face this battle on my own, for my future, for my dreams. The train ride was long, but it gave me time to think. I had to be strategic, careful not to make any rash decisions. My first step was to get to the university and see for myself what had been done. The thought of Sophia walking into those prestigious lecture halls in my place made my blood boil. She had always been the perfect child in my parents' eyes, but I had earned this spot. I had fought for it, and I was not going to let her take it without a fight. I arrived at the university late in the afternoon, just as the campus was beginning to quiet down. I walked through the gates, the grand architecture of the buildings around me taking my breath away. It was everything I had ever dreamed of, everything I had worked for. But it felt tainted now, stained by the deceit that had been forced upon me. I made my way to the admissions office, my steps echoing in the empty hallway. When I arrived, I didn't hesitate. I walked straight to the receptionist, my voice calm but firm. "I'm Emily Williams," I said. "I need to speak to someone about my application." The receptionist looked up from her desk, her expression neutral, but I could see the hesitation in her eyes. She glanced at her computer screen before speaking. "I'm afraid we've already processed your sister, Amanda Williams' acceptance. Are you sure you have the right office?" "No, you're mistaken," I said, my voice steady despite the anger bubbling up inside me. "I'm Emily Williams." Not Amanda. I've worked hard for my place here. I need to speak to someone higher up. Now. She hesitated for a moment before picking up the phone. I could see she was unsure of how to handle the situation. I'll let the dean know you're here, she said quietly. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Every second I spent waiting only increased the pressure in my chest. Finally, the door opened, and a man in his 50s walked in. His eyes were sharp, his demeanor calm, but I could sense his authority the moment he stepped into the room. "Miss Williams," he said, his tone formal. "I'm Dean Thompson. How can I help you?" "I need to discuss my acceptance into the university," I said, not wasting any time. "There seems to be a mix-up. I took the entrance exam, and I should have been accepted. But my sister, Amanda, has been admitted in my place. I demand to know why." The dean's expression faltered for a brief second, but he quickly regained his composure. "There must be some misunderstanding. According to our records, it was Amanda Williams who passed the exam and fulfilled all the requirements for admission." I shook my head, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. "No. I was the one who passed. I'm Emily Williams, not Amanda. You have to believe me." The dean didn't immediately respond. Instead, he turned to his assistant, who had been standing quietly in the corner, watching the exchange. "I'll need to verify the records," the dean said, his tone suddenly more cautious. I wasn't going to wait for them to decide my fate. I couldn't. I had to make them understand that I was not going to accept this lie, this injustice. "Please, verify the records." "I will wait," I said, my voice unwavering. This was just the beginning of the battle. And I wasn't going to let anyone take what was rightfully mine, not Charles, not Sophia, and certainly not the lies that had been constructed to hold me back. Chapter 2, Unraveling the Lies. The room was still, and the weight of the silence pressed down on me like an invisible force. Dean Thompson exchanged a few words with his assistant, who quickly left the room. The tension in the air was palpable, and I could feel the gnawing unease creeping under my skin. The longer this dragged on, the more I could sense the walls closing in. But I couldn't show weakness. I couldn't let them see that the betrayal was cutting deeper than I was willing to admit. The dean sat across from me, his face expressionless as he folded his hands on the desk. His calm demeanor only added to the gnawing feeling in my stomach. I wasn't just fighting for my rightful place at this university, I was fighting against a well-oiled system of deceit. "Miss Williams," he said after a long pause, "if this is truly a case of mistaken identity, we'll need to thoroughly review your claim. But I must tell you, our records clearly show that Amanda Williams met all the criteria. Her documentation was submitted on time, and her exam scores were higher than average." I clenched my fists under the table, forcing myself to stay calm. "You don't understand," I said, keeping my voice steady, though inside, I felt as though I were slowly being suffocated. "I am Emily Williams. I've studied for this exam. I've worked hard for this opportunity. Not Amanda. She didn't take the exam, and she didn't submit any of the documents. Charles, my husband, he's the one who switched the records. He's the one who manipulated everything." The dean's eyes flickered briefly, but he didn't interrupt. I could tell I had struck a nerve, though he was doing his best to keep his composure. But the way he avoided looking directly at me told me everything I needed to know. "You expect me to believe this without evidence?" he asked, his voice cooler now. "Do you have any proof to support these allegations?" I swallowed hard. I didn't have physical evidence, not yet. But the truth was on my side, and I wasn't going to give up. "I don't need proof to tell you what happened," I said, my tone sharp. "You know that if you dig deep enough, you'll find the lies." Just then, the assistant returned, holding a thick folder in her hands. She placed it on the desk in front of the dean. His face remained impassive as he flipped through the pages, his fingers skimming the documents inside. After a moment of silence, he finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. "I see. It seems that our system was tampered with. Your name was indeed replaced with Amanda's." But the documents are valid, though unusual. My heart pounded in my chest, but I didn't let the sense of triumph take over just yet. So, you admit it? You admit that Amanda's records were falsified in my place? The dean nodded, his face tight with the weight of the admission. Yes. But this does not change the fact that Amanda was accepted into the university under false pretenses. Your sister, Miss Williams, has no rightful claim to this spot. I didn't let his words sink in. The shock was still too fresh, and the anger burned too fiercely. I had already been through so much to get here, but now everything was hanging on a thread, as though it could all come undone. I leaned forward, feeling my pulse quicken. I want my place back. I want you to fix this. I worked for this. I earned it. The dean sighed deeply, clearly reluctant to take the next steps. This is a serious matter, Miss Williams. There will be consequences for tampering with the university's records. However, we can only offer you a chance to retake the entrance exam under strict supervision. If you pass, we will consider reinstating your admission. I felt my stomach drop. Retake the exam? I've already passed it. You know that. What you're asking is for me to jump through hoops, just to prove something you should already know. His expression remained stoic. This is the process, Miss Williams. Without clear, irrefutable evidence, this is the only way we can proceed. I stared at him, the weight of the injustice sinking in. It was clear now, this wasn't just about a simple mistake or misunderstanding. This was a system stacked against me, an attempt to erase everything I had worked for, all for the sake of pleasing those in power. But I wasn't about to back down. Not now. I'll take the exam, I said, my voice firm. But mark my words, this isn't over. You've just made it personal. The dean didn't respond. Instead, he simply nodded, signaling that the conversation was over. You'll be contacted with the details. We'll arrange for you to take the exam within the week. The next few days were a blur of frustration and determination. I couldn't believe that after all the effort I had put in, after everything I had sacrificed, I was being forced to jump through bureaucratic hoops. But I had no choice. If I wanted to reclaim my future, I had to play their game. When the day of the exam came, I stood before the university's examination hall, a mixture of dread and defiance swirling within me. There was no room for failure, not this time. I couldn't afford to let them win. As I entered the examination room, I caught a glimpse of the familiar faces of my peers. Many of them had been my classmates in the past. I had seen them grow alongside me, but now, they were strangers. The thought of sharing the same room with them, of proving myself all over again, felt like a bitter pill to swallow. But I didn't let that stop me. The exam was long, grueling, and intense. My mind raced through the questions, my hand moving quickly across the paper. Every word, every problem was a chance for me to prove my worth, to show them that I was the one who deserved this opportunity. Hours passed, but I didn't falter. I didn't hesitate. This was my moment, and I wasn't going to waste it. Days later, the results were posted. My heart thudded in my chest as I made my way to the bulletin board. I scanned the names, my fingers trembling as I searched for my own. There it was, bold and clear, Emily Williams. My name was there, exactly where it was supposed to be. I had passed. It wasn't over yet, though. There was still so much to do, so much to fight for. But for the first time in days, I allowed myself a moment to breathe. My future was still in my hands. And no one, least of all Charles or Sophia, could take that away from me. Chapter 3, The Tide Turns. The morning after the exam results were posted, I woke with a mix of anticipation and dread. The triumph of seeing my name on that list was still fresh, but I knew that the battle wasn't over. The next phase was even more daunting, facing my family, Charles, and Amanda. They would all find out soon, and I wasn't sure how they'd react. My heart weighed heavily with the thought of confronting the people who had betrayed me, especially Charles, my husband, the man who had once promised to stand by me but had stolen my future and handed it to someone else. As I dressed for the day, my mind replayed every painful moment from the past few weeks. How Charles had betrayed me so effortlessly, pushing me aside for Amanda, the golden child, the one everyone had always adored. I had loved him. I had trusted him. And yet, he had chosen to trust her. Now, as I stood at the precipice of my victory, I realized that I wasn't just fighting for my future anymore. I was fighting for my self-worth, for my place in the world. When I entered the living room, I saw Charles sitting on the couch, his eyes glued to the newspaper. He barely acknowledged my presence. It felt like a lifetime ago that I had shared this space with him, but now it seemed like we were strangers. "Amanda's at the university," Charles said, not looking up from his paper. "She's already settling in. I think she'll do well there. I told her she could handle it, just like I always knew she could." I clenched my fists, but I forced myself to remain composed. "You know I passed the exam, right?" My voice was calm, but I could feel the fire brewing within. Charles finally looked up, his face falling as if the realization had hit him just then. "What are you talking about?" His voice was defensive, but I could hear the tremor beneath it. He knew exactly what I was talking about. "I passed," I repeated, this time louder, my voice filled with defiance. "I was the one who worked hard for this. You took my place away from me, Charles. You gave it to Amanda. And now, you're going to fix it." For a long moment, there was silence between us. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Charles's face shifted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw a flicker of guilt in his eyes. But there was no apology. No remorse. "I didn't think you'd ever find out," he muttered, almost to himself. "I thought Amanda would be more accommodating. She always was the easier one. The one who listened, who didn't make waves." He paused, as if weighing his words. "I never meant to hurt you, Emily. I just wanted things to be easier." "Easier for who?" I snapped, finally losing my composure. "You didn't care about what I wanted. You cared about Amanda, and you never thought I was good enough. You betrayed me, Charles. And now, you expect me to sit back and watch you act like nothing ever happened?" Charles's face twisted, and for a moment, I thought he might say something more. But instead, he fell silent, his gaze dropping back to the newspaper, as though he were trying to avoid the conversation altogether. I took a step back, feeling the sting of betrayal more sharply than ever. There was no resolution to this. No apology could fix what had been broken. Turning on my heel, I left the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I was done with the lies. I was done with being the one who was always pushed aside, always second to Amanda. Later that day, I went to the university to speak with the dean again, this time with the results of the exam in hand. As I approached the office, I saw Amanda standing outside, chatting with a few of her new friends. She looked radiant, confident, everything I had once admired about her. But now, as I looked at her, I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal that hung in the air. When she noticed me, her smile faltered for a moment before it returned, though it was strained. "Emily," she said coolly. "I heard you passed the exam." "How surprising." "You know full well that it was supposed to be my spot," I said, walking up to her with a steady, unflinching gaze. "You took what didn't belong to you. But I'm here to take it back." Her eyes flickered with something I couldn't place, guilt, perhaps? "I didn't ask for this," she said, her voice tight. "Charles made his choice. I didn't force him. I didn't even know about it until the acceptance letter came. It wasn't supposed to happen like this." "Maybe not," I said, my voice hardening. "But it did. And now you have a chance to fix it. The university will recognize the truth. I'll make sure of it." Amanda's expression softened, and for a moment, I saw a hint of vulnerability in her eyes. "Emily, I never wanted to hurt you. I always thought you'd have your chance, too." "You took my chance, Amanda," I said, my voice low but steady. "And now, I'm taking it back." I turned and walked into the dean's office, where the battle for my future awaited. The following days were a whirlwind of meetings, paperwork, and confrontations. The university couldn't ignore the truth forever. As I fought for my rightful place, I watched as Amanda and Charles began to unravel. They tried to maintain their facade, but every day, the truth came closer to light. Charles eventually faced the consequences of his actions. The university launched an investigation, and his role in the falsification of records was exposed. The truth was impossible to deny. Amanda, too, was forced to face the fact that her place at the university had been built on lies. Though she didn't lose her spot entirely, she was now subjected to a public reckoning. In the end, I stood where I belonged. My name was reinstated, and I was accepted into the university. I had fought for my place, and I had won. But this victory wasn't just about reclaiming my education. It was about reclaiming my life, my self-worth, and my future. As I walked across the campus on my first day, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. This was just the beginning. No longer would I allow anyone to define who I was. I would write my own story, one where I was in control, and nothing could take that away from me. And for once, I knew that I was exactly where I was meant to be. Chapter 4: Reclaiming the Future. The first few weeks at the university were a blur of lectures, assignments, and navigating the complicated social web of my new life. I felt like a stranger in a place that was supposed to be my second home. But I couldn't shake the sense of triumph that came with every day I spent here. This was my victory, not just for me, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or denied their rightful place. As I walked across the campus, the heavy weight of my past still lingered in the back of my mind. Charles's betrayal. Amanda's duplicity. The constant feeling of being someone else's shadow. But with each step I took toward my future, I felt the layers of that weight begin to peel away. I had been given a second chance, a fresh start, and I wasn't going to squander it. I often found myself sitting in the quiet corners of the campus library, diving into my studies with a determination I hadn't known I was capable of. The familiar feeling of being an outsider, the one who wasn't supposed to be here, had slowly begun to fade. Here, I wasn't just Emily, Charles's overlooked wife, or Amanda's discarded sister. Here, I was Emily, the student. The fighter. The woman who had reclaimed her life. One afternoon, as I sat in the cafe, surrounded by the sounds of chattering students and the hum of conversation, I saw a familiar face walking toward me. It was Charles. His eyes met mine across the room, and for a moment, I saw that familiar mixture of regret and guilt in them. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether to approach, but then, as if driven by some invisible force, he took a few steps closer. "Emily," he said, his voice strained, his hands stuffed awkwardly into his pockets. I wanted to apologize. I know I've said that before, but I need you to understand that I was wrong. I made the wrong choice. And now, seeing you here, I realize how much I've hurt you. I'm sorry." I looked at him, trying to gauge his sincerity. It was hard to ignore the weight of his apology, but I couldn't let myself forget what he had done. The lies. The betrayal. The way he had taken everything I had worked for and handed it to someone else without a second thought. "Sorry doesn't change anything," I replied, my voice steady but firm. "You took my place, Charles. You didn't think about me. You didn't think about the person I was or what I deserved. And now, it's too late." He looked down at the table, clearly defeated. "I know. I realize that now. I thought it would be easier, with Amanda, with her perfect image, but I was wrong. I didn't see you, truly see you, until it was too late." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "You didn't just betray me, Charles. You betrayed everything I believed in. I'm not the woman I was before. I'm not the one who will take your sorry apologies anymore. You can't take back the past." Charles nodded, his eyes darkened with regret. "I understand. But if there's any way I can make it right." "You can't," I said, cutting him off gently but decisively. "This is something I have to do on my own." With that, he fell silent, and for a long moment, we just sat there. The awkward tension in the air was thick, but I felt an overwhelming sense of calm wash over me. I didn't need Charles to make things right anymore. I had done that for myself. After a few moments, Charles stood up, his face pale with the weight of everything unsaid. "I'm sorry, Emily. I hope you find what you're looking for here. I really do." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving me to sit in the quiet of the cafe, alone but stronger than before. The following months passed quickly. My life at university settled into a rhythm, and I found myself immersed in my studies, making new friends, and slowly carving out my own space in the world. But as time passed, I found it harder and harder to ignore the pull of the past. There were moments when I missed my family, when I missed the sense of belonging I used to have. But every time that urge to go back to them surfaced, I reminded myself of everything they had taken from me. Amanda, too, had not disappeared from my life. She had tried to reach out a few times, sending messages through mutual friends, asking for my forgiveness. But I had long since realized that forgiveness wasn't a gift I was willing to give. Not yet. Perhaps one day, but not now. I had made peace with the fact that my family could no longer be my safety net. They had shown me that love was conditional, that loyalty was something they could easily discard when it suited them. But I had also learned that I was capable of standing on my own. I had found my own worth again, and no one, least of all Charles or Amanda, could take that away from me. The day the final exam results arrived, I stood before the board, watching as the names were posted one by one. I had given everything to this. Every ounce of energy, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt had led me here. And now, standing at the threshold of my future, I was filled with a quiet sense of accomplishment. When I saw my name at the top of the list, my heart swelled with pride. I had done it. Not just for me, but for every person who had ever been told they weren't enough, that they couldn't achieve something. I had proven that with enough determination and strength, anything was possible. And as I stood there, finally free from the shadows of my past, I knew that my story wasn't over. This was just the beginning. A new chapter had begun, and I was ready to write it, one where I would always be the author of my own fate. The future was mine to shape. Chapter 5, A New Beginning. The weeks after the exam results felt like a surreal dream. I had worked hard to get to this point, but now that I was finally here, it was hard to believe it. My name was at the top of the list, and I was officially a student at one of the country's most prestigious universities. The world seemed to open up before me, full of possibilities and opportunities one had never imagined in my previous life. But even with the new triumphs and excitement that came with my achievements, the past still lingered in the corners of my mind. It was impossible to forget what had happened, to forget the lies, the betrayal, and the feeling of being discarded by those I had trusted the most. Yet, as I walked through the university campus, I felt a growing sense of freedom. The weight that had once crushed me was no longer there. I was no longer bound by my past, by my family's expectations, or by Charles's actions. I had claimed my place here, not just in the academic world, but in my own life. The shadow of Amanda's perfection and my family's disappointment no longer hung over me. I was no longer defined by what others thought I should be. I had learned, through pain and loss, that I could define my own worth, and that alone made this journey worthwhile. One day, as I was walking to class, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out to see a message from an unfamiliar number. It was a short, straightforward text: "Emily, I need to talk to you. It's important." My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a number I recognized, but something about it felt familiar. I had no interest in revisiting my past or rekindling old connections, but there was something in the message that made me hesitate. I had come so far, and yet, I realized I couldn't fully move forward without confronting everything that had brought me here. I decided to reply, my fingers hesitating for a moment before I typed, "Who is this?" The response came almost instantly: "It's Amanda. Please, just hear me out. I owe you that much." I stared at the message for a long time. Amanda. The sister who had stolen my place in everything, my family's love, my future, and even my identity. She had ruined my chances and taken everything from me. But at the same time, I realized that the anger I had once felt was slowly fading, replaced by something else. I wasn't sure what to call it, but it wasn't the fiery rage that had burned inside me before. I finally typed back, "Fine. Meet me at the cafe at 3 p.m. The cafe was quiet when I arrived, the soft hum of conversation and the clink of coffee cups filling the space. I sat at a corner table, watching the door with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. A few minutes passed before she entered, her eyes scanning the room before locking onto mine. Amanda walked toward me, her movements hesitant, her usual confidence gone. She looked different somehow, older, more fragile than I remembered. Gone was the golden child who had always been the star of our family. Now, she seemed like a woman weighed down by her own choices. When she sat down, she took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them on the table. "Emily," she began softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I need you to know something. I've made so many mistakes. I've ruined everything, and I can't go on pretending like I haven't." I didn't say anything, just looked at her, letting the silence hang between us. She wasn't the person I had once looked up to, but neither was I the same person who had begged for her approval. Amanda's eyes welled up with tears, her voice shaking as she continued, "I was so caught up in trying to be perfect, trying to be everything our parents wanted, that I lost sight of what really mattered. I saw how much you loved Charles, and I saw how you were always there, always sacrificing for everyone else. But I was selfish. I took it all from you. I wanted what you had, but I didn't realize what I was taking from you in the process." The words felt hollow, but they were genuine, and for the first time in years, I saw her as just another person who had made mistakes, someone who had lost their way, just like I had once lost mine. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. "Why now, Amanda? Why come to me now, after everything?" My voice was calm, but underneath, there was a torrent of emotions I hadn't fully processed yet. "Why should I forgive you after everything you've done?" She swallowed hard, looking down at her hands. "Because I'm not the person I was before. I see now what I did to you, and I'm so sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know the truth. I wasn't trying to steal your life. I thought I was helping our family, but I was just trying to fill a void that wasn't mine to fill." The silence stretched on for a moment as I let her words sink in. I had spent so much time hating her, wishing for retribution, for some kind of justice for the years I had lost. But now, faced with her vulnerability, I realized that I had been holding on to the past for too long. Finally, I spoke, my voice steady but not without emotion. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Amanda. I don't know if I ever will. But I'm not going to let what you did define me anymore. I've worked too hard to get to where I am now. And I'm not going to let you, or anyone else, take that away from me." Amanda nodded, tears falling freely now. "I understand," she whispered. "I just wanted to tell you the truth, Emily. I wanted you to know that I'm sorry for everything." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of the past lingered between us, but I knew I had moved past it. I had taken control of my own future, and I wasn't going to let anything, whether it was Amanda, Charles, or my family, stand in my way anymore. As she left, I felt a sense of finality. The past was over. Whatever happened next, I was the one in control of my destiny. And for the first time in my life, I was free. Epilogue, a future rewritten. As the years went by, I continued to thrive in my studies, eventually graduating with honors. But beyond academics, I learned the greatest lesson of all, that strength doesn't come from never falling. It comes from getting up every time you do. From facing the pain, acknowledging the scars, and using them to build a future that belongs to you. And as I stood there on my graduation day, looking out at the world before me, I knew that nothing could stop me now. I had rewritten my story. And this time, it was a story of my choosing. Chapter 6, The Path Ahead. The days that followed my conversation with Amanda were filled with mixed emotions. The weight of the past still lingered, but it no longer had the power to consume me. I walked through my university life with a newfound sense of freedom. The world was no longer an obstacle, but an opportunity for me to explore. As I immersed myself in my studies and extracurricular activities, I began to build the future I had always dreamed of, one that was no longer overshadowed by my family's expectations or the betrayal that had shaped my earlier years. The next semester, I found myself in an unexpected position, leading a group project that brought together students from different disciplines. It was a huge responsibility, but I felt strangely confident. The old Emily, the one who always sought validation from others, would have been terrified at the thought of failing. But this Emily, strong, independent, and determined, not only embraced the challenge but thrived in it. The project was a collaborative effort to create a proposal for a sustainable business that would address environmental concerns. My group consisted of people from different majors, including a quiet economics student named Lucas, a charismatic marketing major named Priya, and a sharp engineering student named David. As we worked together, I couldn't help but notice how differently I interacted with them. I no longer sought their approval or validation. I simply let my ideas flow and allowed others to contribute in ways that enhanced the project. One evening, as we sat in the library putting the final touches on our presentation, Lucas looked up from his laptop, his eyes curious. "Emily," he asked, "where did all this drive come from? You've been unstoppable this whole time." I paused, taking a moment to reflect before answering. The question caught me off guard. It was rare that anyone ever asked me about my journey or the transformation I'd undergone in such a direct way. Most people simply saw the confident, composed version of me that had emerged after years of struggle, but few truly understood the depth of the changes I'd experienced. "I guess," I began slowly, choosing my words carefully, "I used to be afraid. I used to let the opinions of others control how I saw myself, and I thought my worth was defined by what they expected from me. But that all changed. I had to learn the hard way that my future isn't theirs to shape. I'm the only one who can define it." Lucas nodded, seemingly understanding the weight behind my words. Priya, who had been working on her phone, looked up and smiled. "That's really inspiring, Emily. Honestly, I think that's why you've been such a great leader for this project. You know what you want, and you go for it." I smiled back, grateful for her kind words. It felt good to hear that my hard work and growth hadn't gone unnoticed. It was moments like these that made all the pain and hardship worthwhile. As the weeks passed, my life started to feel like it was falling into place. The project was a success, and it brought me recognition from both my professors and my peers. I felt proud, but more importantly, I felt empowered. This was my life, and I was no longer just drifting along. I had taken control, and I was steering my own ship. But there were still moments when my past crept back into my mind. Moments when I thought about Amanda and the years I had lost to her lies. There were days when I would catch myself wondering what my family thought of me now. Had they even noticed my absence? Or were they too busy trying to make Amanda their golden child? It wasn't easy to push those thoughts aside, but I had learned that I didn't need their approval. I had my own goals now. And I wasn't going to let anything, not even the people I once thought I needed most, stand in my way. One evening, as I was heading back to my dorm after a long day of classes and meetings, I received an unexpected message. It was from my mother. "Emily, I want to talk to you. Can we meet tomorrow? There are some things I need to say." I stared at the screen for a long moment. My heart raced, and 1,000 thoughts flooded my mind. Was this about Amanda? About my past? Or was it something else? Part of me wanted to ignore it, to keep moving forward and not revisit those painful memories. But the other part, the part that still longed for some kind of closure, knew that I needed to face it. I couldn't truly move on until I had confronted the people who had shaped my past. The next afternoon, I found myself sitting across from my mother at a small cafe. She looked different too, older, perhaps even more tired than I remembered. When she saw me, she hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Emily," she began, her voice soft, "I know I've hurt you. I know I've failed you in ways I can't undo. And I can never make up for what happened with Amanda. I stayed silent, watching her carefully. I wasn't sure where this conversation was going, but part of me already knew what was coming. My mother had always been someone who cared more about appearances than about the truth. It had always been easier for her to side with Amanda, to pretend everything was fine, rather than face the uncomfortable reality of our family's dysfunction. I should have seen what was happening, she continued, her voice trembling slightly. I should have known how much you were hurting, how much you were sacrificing for us. But I was blinded by my own desires. I wanted the easy path, the one where Amanda was the perfect daughter and you were the one who always did what was expected of you. I'm sorry. Her apology hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. The hurt I had felt for so long seemed to swell up inside me. But instead of anger, a quiet sadness washed over me. I had waited for this moment, for my family to recognize the pain they had caused. But now that it was here, I wasn't sure what to do with it. I don't need your apology, I finally said, my voice steady but firm. I needed you to see me for who I was. Not just as a tool to help you or to live up to your expectations, but as your daughter. I needed to feel like I mattered. Like I wasn't just a placeholder for your dreams. She reached out, her hand shaking as she tried to touch mine. I know, Emily. I know. And I wish I could turn back time. But I can't. All I can do now is try to make things right, if you'll let me. I looked at her hand, then back at her face. For a moment, I thought about what it would mean to let go of the bitterness, to forgive her, and to move forward. But then, I realized that I had already forgiven her in my own way. I didn't need her forgiveness or her approval anymore. I had built my own future. And I was finally free. I don't need you to fix anything, I said softly, standing up from the table. I've already done that for myself. Epilogue, A New Dawn. Years passed, and as I walked across the stage at my graduation ceremony, I felt a sense of fulfillment I had never known before. The pain of my past was still there, but it no longer defined me. I had carved my own path, faced my demons, and emerged stronger. I wasn't the same person who had walked into university years ago, unsure of her place in the world. I had grown into someone who knew exactly who she was, and what she was capable of. I had finally taken control of my life, and as I looked ahead, I knew the future was full of endless possibilities. Whatever came next, I was ready. Epilogue continued, The Future I Choose. As I stood at the front of the graduation hall, holding my diploma, I took a deep breath. The weight of the past few years seemed to settle around me like a cloak. The long nights of studying, the countless hours spent wrestling with my thoughts, and the gradual process of self-discovery had all led to this moment. Behind me, my classmates cheered and celebrated their accomplishments. They had each fought their own battles to reach this day, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to be surrounded by the shared energy of their triumphs. This wasn't just my victory, it was the collective achievement of every person who had believed in themselves, despite the challenges life had thrown at them. As the ceremony concluded, I made my way outside to meet Lucas, Priya, and David. They were waiting for me with wide smiles, their faces radiating the same sense of accomplishment that I felt. You did it! Priya exclaimed, throwing her arms around me in a tight hug. We did it! All the hard work paid off. Lucas, always the quiet one, gave me a knowing smile. You led us through the toughest moments, Emily. You kept us grounded. David, ever the optimist, slapped me on the back. Who knew you'd become the shining star of the group? We couldn't have done it without you. The pride in their voices filled me with warmth. In a world where I had always struggled to find my place, these friendships, genuine, untainted by my past, were a reflection of who I had become. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. The moment was interrupted by a familiar voice calling my name. I turned, and to my surprise, it was Amanda standing at the edge of the crowd, looking a little out of place in her formal dress. Her eyes locked onto mine with an expression that I couldn't quite read, part relief, part hesitation. I felt a flash of tension in my chest, but it didn't last long. This was my moment, and no one, not even Amanda, could take that away from me. "Emily," she said softly, walking toward me. "Can we talk?" I looked at my friends, who exchanged glances but didn't try to intervene. With a small nod, I gestured for them to give us some space. They silently moved away, leaving Amanda and me alone on the steps. "What do you need, Amanda?" I asked, my voice calm but guarded. In the years since the betrayal, I had learned that confrontation wasn't always about anger, it was about understanding what truly mattered. She took a deep breath, her hands nervously clasped in front of her. "I've been watching you. I've seen everything you've achieved, and I know I was wrong. I've always known I couldn't take your place. I wanted something more. And I hurt you in the process." I studied her face, her sincerity evident in the way she spoke. Amanda had never been one to show vulnerability, but now, there was a softness in her eyes I had never seen before. "I don't need an apology from you, Amanda," I replied, the words coming more easily than I expected. "What I needed was for you to understand that I was never just a stepping stone for you or anyone else. And you didn't just hurt me, you hurt yourself too." She nodded, her expression reflecting regret, but it was clear that this moment wasn't about fixing the past. It was about acknowledging the harm we had both endured. "I've learned that the hard way," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could have it all, but in the end, I lost everything that truly mattered." For a moment, we stood there in silence, the weight of our shared history between us. But instead of anger or bitterness, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. My journey had been long and difficult, but I had made it through. I had rebuilt myself from the ground up. "I've forgiven you, Amanda," I said softly. "But I've also learned that my life is mine to control. It's not defined by you, by anyone else. And I'm not going to let anyone, family or otherwise, take that away from me again." Her eyes welled with tears, and she nodded. "I understand. I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted you to know that." With that, Amanda turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to chase after her or seek her approval. I had done the hardest thing, let go. The next few months passed in a blur of new beginnings. I received job offers from several prestigious companies, but instead of rushing into any one of them, I took my time. This was a new chapter, and I wasn't in a rush anymore. I wanted to choose a path that aligned with my values, not one dictated by the expectations of others. In the end, I chose to join a nonprofit organization focused on providing education and opportunities to underprivileged communities. It was a decision that felt right, one that combined my passion for helping others with the stability and independence I had fought so hard to achieve. Years later, I found myself in a different place altogether. I had built a life that was mine, one where I didn't have to worry about living up to anyone's standards but my own. I had a career I loved, friends who truly cared about me, and, most importantly, I had found peace with myself. And as I looked back on the journey, on the girl who once lived in the shadows of her family's expectations and the woman who now stood tall in the light of her own choices, I knew that the road ahead was filled with endless possibilities. As I settled into my new life, I often thought about how far I had come. The girl who had once been betrayed, neglected, and diminished by those closest to her was now a woman who could stand on her own, no longer a shadow of someone else's dreams. I had reclaimed my identity, my purpose, and most importantly, my sense of self-worth. But there were moments, like when I walked into the nonprofit office for the first time as an official employee, when I realized how much strength it had taken to get to this point. My hands, though still shaky at times, had been the ones to build this life from nothing. I had fought for my place, not just in the world, but within myself. The work at the nonprofit was rewarding, but not without its challenges. The stories I heard every day, the faces of children eager to learn despite the odds stacked against them, reminded me of my own journey. In many ways, I saw myself in them, lost, unsure of where to go, and yet determined to find a way out of the darkness. As time passed, I became more and more involved in shaping the nonprofit's initiatives. I worked closely with local communities, helping build programs that gave underprivileged children the tools to rise above their circumstances, just as I had once dreamed of doing for myself. I found satisfaction in knowing that the work I was doing was making a difference, that the impact of the organization could create lasting change. One evening, after a long day of meetings and community outreach, I found myself sitting on the balcony of my small but cozy apartment, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The city lights flickered to life below, a reminder of how far I had come from the days when I felt invisible in the vastness of the world. It was in those quiet moments that I allowed myself to reflect on everything I had overcome. The rejection, the betrayal, the pain, it had all been part of the process, a test of my resilience and ability to rise from the ashes. And now, as I looked out over the city that I had conquered in my own way, I realized that I was no longer afraid of the future. I had learned to trust myself. The following months brought with them unexpected encounters and moments of joy. One particular evening, as I attended a fundraiser for the nonprofit, I caught sight of an old familiar face across the room. It was Ethan, my husband from the past, the man who had once torn my life apart with his choices and his trust in others. He looked different, older, a little more weary, but there was no mistaking the remorse in his eyes when they met mine. He had been standing with a group of people, but as soon as our gazes locked, he excused himself and made his way over to where I stood. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He simply stood there, his hands shoved into his pockets, looking as though he were waiting for some sign from me. "Emily," he said finally, his voice quiet, almost apologetic. "I didn't expect to see you here." I took a breath, my thoughts racing. Ethan had never been the person I had hoped he would be. His actions had caused irreparable damage in my life, and yet, in the years that had passed, I had moved on. His presence, although jarring at first, no longer held the same weight. "I could say the same," I replied, my tone neutral but steady. "What are you doing here, Ethan?" He hesitated before answering. "I've been following your work," he said. "I've heard a lot about the nonprofit and what you've done for these kids. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. For everything. I realize now how wrong I was, how much I hurt you." I studied him for a moment, weighing his words. In the past, this would have been the moment where I would have felt a surge of vindication, the satisfaction of being proven right. But now, it was different. I no longer needed his apology to validate my worth. "You made your choices, Ethan," I said quietly, my voice firm but not unkind. "And I made mine." He nodded, looking down at his feet for a moment before looking back up at me. "I've been trying to make amends for the things I've done. But I know I can't change the past. I wanted you to know that I regret everything. And I'm sorry for how I treated you." I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. It wasn't that I had forgiven him, because forgiveness wasn't something I owed him, but I had learned to let go of the anger. I had learned to forgive myself. "You don't have to apologize to me, Ethan," I said softly. "The only person you need to make amends with is yourself." He looked at me, and for the first time in a long time, I saw the sincerity in his eyes. "I hope one day you'll be able to move on completely. I know I've hurt you beyond measure, but I want you to know that I'm trying to be a better person." I nodded, giving him a small smile. "Good luck with that, Ethan. But I've moved on. I've found my place in this world, and I don't need your approval to feel complete anymore." With that, I turned away from him, walking back into the crowd of people, my heart lighter than it had been in years. Ethan's apology no longer mattered. What mattered was that I had found peace within myself, and nothing from my past could take that away. A few years later, I stood at the front of a new community center built by the nonprofit, cutting the ribbon at its grand opening. It was a testament to the progress we had made, to the children whose lives had been changed, and to the strength of the people who had helped make it all possible. As the crowd cheered, I looked around at the familiar faces of my friends, my colleagues, and the children whose futures had been altered by the work we had done together. I couldn't help but smile. This was the future I had fought for. This was the life I had chosen. And it was more than enough. In that moment, I knew that the past, no matter how painful, had been the catalyst for the woman I had become. I had fought for my future, and now, with the support of those I had gathered around me, I was living it to the fullest. And as the sun set behind the horizon, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, I was ready to face them, stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever before. Years passed, and my life unfolded like a story of resilience, each chapter marked by growth, triumph, and the courage to stand tall in the face of adversity. My efforts with the nonprofit had not only transformed the lives of the children we served but had also paved the way for my own personal evolution. Every day, I woke up with purpose, knowing that my work was making a difference, that my actions, no matter how small, were changing the world. There were still moments of doubt, moments when I questioned whether I was enough, or if I could keep pushing forward when things felt overwhelming. But I had learned to embrace those moments. They no longer held the power they once did. I had the strength to confront my insecurities, and with each challenge, I grew stronger, more confident. I found myself speaking at conferences and events, sharing my story, and encouraging others to follow their own paths toward healing and success. My voice had become one that spoke not just of the hardships I had endured, but of the strength I had discovered within myself. One evening, after a particularly impactful speech, I was approached by a young woman named Lily. Her eyes were wide with admiration, and she held a notebook tightly in her hands. She introduced herself as someone who had been following my work for years and had been inspired by the way I had turned my pain into purpose. "I just want to say thank you," Lily said, her voice soft but filled with sincerity. "Your story made me believe that I could do more, that I could overcome what happened to me. You've inspired me to start my own nonprofit. I don't know how I can ever repay you for that." Her words hit me in a way that I hadn't expected. It was one thing to know that my work was making an impact, but to hear it from someone who had been directly influenced by it, it was a reminder that the ripple effect of our actions could reach far beyond what we could ever see. "Lily, you don't need to repay me," I replied, my voice filled with warmth. "Just keep going. Keep fighting for the lives you want to change, and remember that no matter how hard it gets, you have everything within you to make it happen." She smiled, and I could see the determination in her eyes. It reminded me of who I had been years ago, unsure, scared, but with a quiet resolve to carve my own path. A few years later, I received a letter from the prestigious university that had once been my dream. It was an invitation to speak at their annual graduation ceremony, an honor that left me both humbled and overwhelmed. I had never imagined that the girl who had once been cast aside, told that her dreams didn't matter, would one day be invited back to speak at the very place that had rejected her. Standing in front of a crowd of graduates, their faces full of excitement and anticipation for the futures that lay before them, I shared my story. I spoke of resilience, of fighting for what was rightfully mine, and of the strength we all carried within ourselves to shape our destinies. As I spoke, I could see the faces in the crowd reflect a mixture of hope, admiration, and understanding. I knew that my words were reaching them, that they would carry something with them long after they left the auditorium. After the ceremony, I found myself once again face to face with Ethan. He was standing in the back of the room, as if waiting for the right moment. When our eyes met, there was a softness to his gaze, a quiet recognition of the woman I had become. His expression was unreadable, but I could sense the weight of his regret, the years of reflection that had brought him to this point. "You were right," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't understand then, but I see it now. Everything you've become, everything you've done, it's more than I ever thought possible. I'm proud of you." His words were an acknowledgement of the past, of all the hurt, but they didn't carry the weight they once did. I had long let go of the need for his approval, his validation. In fact, I was grateful for his confession. It was a sign of the change he had made within himself, even if it was too late for us. "You don't need to say that," I replied calmly. "I'm no longer the girl you used to know. I've moved on. I've made my own way, and that's what matters." He nodded, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I know. But still, I wanted you to hear it." And with that, we both moved on, no longer tethered by the past, but free to live our separate lives. The man who had once betrayed me was no longer a figure in my story. His place was in the past, and I had long since stepped into my own future. As I continued my work, I encountered many people, all with their own stories of struggle and triumph. I met young women who, like me, had been pushed aside by the people they loved, and I shared my experiences with them, hoping that they, too, would find the strength to rise. The work was far from easy. There were days when the burden of it all felt too heavy to bear, but in those moments, I reminded myself of how far I had come. I had fought for this, and I would keep fighting, for the children who needed a voice, for the women who deserved to be heard, and for myself, the woman I had become. In the end, my journey wasn't about revenge or getting back at the people who had wronged me. It was about finding peace within myself, reclaiming my identity, and choosing my own path, no matter the obstacles in my way. I had faced the darkness, and in doing so, I had created a life full of light. And with that, I knew I had truly changed my fate. The sun set on another day, and as I stood at the balcony of my office, looking out at the city below, I smiled. The future was mine to shape, and no one, could take that from me. As the years passed, my work and the lessons I had learned continued to shape the direction of my life. What had started as a quiet determination to reclaim my future had blossomed into a profound journey of purpose and impact. With every project I led, every woman and child I helped, I felt my heart grow stronger, more resilient. The nonprofit flourished, expanding its reach and changing the lives of countless individuals. I was no longer just an advocate or a speaker. I had become a symbol of what was possible when one refused to be defined by the past, when one chose to rise above the circumstances that sought to limit them. My journey wasn't easy. There were still moments of doubt, moments where the weight of responsibility threatened to overwhelm me. But I had learned not to shy away from those moments. Instead, I embraced them as a reminder of how far I had come, of the strength I had built through adversity. I kept in touch with Lily, the young woman who had been inspired by my story. Over the years, she had become a leader in her own right, guiding her own nonprofit dedicated to helping young girls in underprivileged areas gain access to education. Our paths continued to cross, and I found a deep sense of fulfillment in knowing that the ripple of my actions was still spreading, touching lives in ways I had never imagined. But there was one chapter that had been left unfinished, a chapter that had been written in pain but now stood as a quiet reminder of how far I had come. Ethan. It had been years since we had last spoken, but his presence lingered in my thoughts, as it had for so long. I had forgiven him, not for his sake, but for my own peace. He had been a part of my past, yes, but he no longer held the power to dictate my present or future. Still, I often wondered if he had truly learned from the mistakes he had made. One crisp autumn afternoon, I found myself walking through the park near my office, lost in thought, when I spotted a familiar figure sitting on a bench beneath a tree. His back was to me, but there was no mistaking him. Ethan. The years had not been kind to him. His face was marked by the weight of time, the lines of regret etched deeply across his features. He looked older, more tired than I remembered. For a moment, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to turn away, to continue walking as though I hadn't seen him at all. But another part, the part that had grown stronger over the years, urged me to approach him. Taking a deep breath, I walked toward him, each step a testament to the strength I had built since that painful chapter of my life. When I reached him, I stopped, and he turned toward me. His eyes widened in surprise, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though he didn't quite know how to react. "You," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You look different." I finished for him, a faint smile tugging at my lips. "Yes. I've changed." He nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and admiration. "I see that. You've become everything I never believed you could be." I studied him for a moment. He had once been my everything, and now, he was just a man sitting before me, a part of a life that had long since passed. But there was no anger in me anymore, no bitterness. Just a quiet sense of resolution. "You know," I said softly, "you are a part of my past. But I've made peace with it. I've moved on, Ethan." I'm living the life I was meant to live. And I've learned to be okay with that. His gaze dropped to the ground for a moment, and when he looked back up, there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. I never understood, back then. I thought I knew what was best for you, for both of us. But I was wrong. I see that now. I nodded, not out of bitterness, but out of recognition. You did what you thought was right. But you were wrong. And I had to learn to live without your approval, without your belief in me. That's where I found my strength. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the distant hum of city life filled the silence between us. It was a silence that no longer felt heavy or suffocating, but peaceful, a moment of closure. I wish I could change the past, Ethan said, his voice quiet but sincere. But I know I can't. All I can do is hope that, somehow, you'll find it in your heart to forgive me. I looked at him, and for the first time, I truly saw him, not as the man who had once broken my heart, but as a man who had learned from his mistakes, who had come to understand the consequences of his actions. I forgave you a long time ago, Ethan, I said gently. But forgiveness isn't for you, it's for me. And I've made peace with everything that happened. I hope you can do the same. He nodded, the weight of his own past still visible in his eyes. But there was a sense of release in his expression, as if my words had lifted some of that burden. I'll never forget what I did, he said softly. But I can't change it. I can only hope that one day, you'll be able to look back on everything without regret. I smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. I already do. With that, I turned to leave. There was nothing more to say, no need for further words. The chapter had been closed long ago. I was no longer defined by the pain, by the betrayal. I had found my own path, one that was full of purpose, fulfillment, and self-worth. As I walked away, the weight of the past finally lifted entirely. I had lived through it, I had learned from it, and now, I was free. The future was mine, and it was bright. And with that, I stepped forward into the next chapter of my life. As I walked away from Ethan, the air seemed lighter, the world around me a little brighter. I had come full circle, from the naive young woman who had been manipulated and discarded to the strong, independent person I had become. The weight of years of hurt and betrayal had been lifted, and I felt a sense of freedom I had never known before. The nonprofit I had poured so much of myself into had become my life's work. It was my way of ensuring that the pain I had endured would never go to waste. Every woman we helped, every child we supported, every person who found hope through our efforts reminded me that I had made the right choice in not allowing my past to define me. That evening, I returned home to my apartment, which had become my sanctuary over the years. It was small, simple, but it was mine. I had worked hard to create a space that reflected the life I had rebuilt from the ashes of my former self. There were no reminders of Ethan, no remnants of the past that had once haunted me. It was a place of peace, a place where I could finally breathe. I had learned to be alone, and I had learned to love myself. And in doing so, I had found a strength I never knew I had. I didn't need Ethan's approval, or anyone's for that matter. My value came from within, and I had learned to trust in my own judgment and abilities. But as I stood in front of the mirror, I realized that there was still one thing I had yet to fully understand, the importance of my own happiness. I had spent so many years fighting for justice, for validation, and for the truth, but in doing so, I had neglected to truly embrace joy. The years of struggle had made me stronger, but they had also left me with scars, both visible and invisible. It was time for me to heal, not just the wounds inflicted by others, but the ones I had inflicted on myself by not allowing myself to be happy. The next day, I decided to take a step back from my work. I needed to reconnect with myself, to rediscover the things that brought me joy outside of my mission. I began spending time doing simple things, taking walks in the park, visiting local cafes, reading books that weren't about advocacy or empowerment. I found comfort in the small moments, in the quiet stillness of life. One afternoon, I received an unexpected call. It was from Lily, the young woman I had mentored and who had since started her own nonprofit. Her voice was full of excitement and gratitude as she shared how her organization had grown and how many lives they were changing together. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said, her words filled with sincerity. "You've taught me so much. Not just about the work, but about resilience, about strength, and about the importance of believing in myself. You've changed my life." I was touched, more than I could express. I had poured so much of my heart into my work, but hearing her words reminded me of why I had started in the first place. It wasn't about revenge or proving anything to anyone, it was about creating something meaningful, about making a difference in the world. As the months passed, I continued to find a balance between my personal life and my work. I began to forge new connections with people who shared my passion for social change, but also with those who reminded me that life was about more than just the battles we fought. It was about love, kindness, and the moments that made us feel alive. And then one day, while attending a conference on women's rights, I met someone new. His name was Daniel, and he was a fellow advocate for human rights. He was kind, thoughtful, and shared many of my values. We struck up a conversation, and over the course of several weeks, we found that we had a lot in common. But what struck me the most about Daniel was how he made me feel seen, valued, and appreciated for who I was, not for what I had endured. He didn't look at me with pity, nor did he see me as someone defined by my past. He saw me as I was in the present, and that was a gift I had never truly known. As we spent more time together, I realized that I was finally ready to open my heart again. Not out of a need to fill an empty space, but because I had come to understand that love was not something I needed to fight for or prove, it was something that could simply be, if I was willing to let it. Daniel and I began to build something new, something free from the burdens of the past. We took our time, allowing the relationship to grow naturally. And for the first time in a long while, I felt that my heart was no longer a place of fear or guardedness. It was open, ready to experience the fullness of life, love, happiness, and everything in between. Years later, I found myself standing on a stage, speaking to a room full of people about the work I had done, the lives I had touched, and the journey I had taken to get to where I was. As I looked out at the audience, I saw faces filled with hope and determination. These were people who were ready to make their own mark on the world, to fight for what they believed in. And I realized, in that moment, that my journey had come full circle. I had found not only my purpose but also my peace. I had overcome the pain of my past, and in doing so, I had forged a future that was entirely my own. The final chapter of my story wasn't about revenge or reclaiming what had been stolen from me, it was about growth, healing, and finding the courage to live a life of joy, authenticity, and love. And as I looked toward the future, I knew that my story was far from over. There were still so many lives to touch, so many battles to fight, and so much to look forward to. But for the first time, I was no longer defined by the pain I had suffered. I was defined by the strength I had found within myself. And that was enough. The end.